Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a harrowing journey into the heart of Appalachian darkness with 8 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever documented from these ancient mountains. These accounts are not drawn from folklore or mountain legends, but from the lived testimonies of individuals whose encounters with the unknown forever changed their understanding of what lurks in the hollows and ridges of Appalachia. Each story takes us deep into isolated mountain communities and shadowed valleys, revealing spine-chilling encounters that span unsolved mysteries, occult practices, violent histories, and the primal terror that only nature's most remote places can unleash. The details have been meticulously preserved and verified through multiple sources, ensuring that the authenticity of these stories remains uncompromised, while some names and locations have been changed to protect the privacy of those who lived through these nightmares. From the vanishing hikers of Black Rock Trail to the dark secrets hidden within snake-handling congregations, tonight we explore the disturbing truth that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. If you have not yet joined our growing community of truth seekers, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell, so you never miss a single investigation when the buried past resurfaces. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own encounters with the unexplained or which story disturbed you the most. I never thought I would be sharing this story, but after 2 years of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, I figure maybe putting it out there might help someone else. I was 29, working as a park ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. The kind of job where you spend your days maintaining trails, educating visitors about leave no trace principles, and occasionally helping lost tourists find their way back to civilization. It was peaceful work in one of the most beautiful wilderness areas in Appalachia, where ancient mountains stretch endlessly into misty horizons and thick forests hide secrets that go back centuries. Madison was my name then, and I had been working the backcountry patrol for 3 years when everything changed that October. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers over 700,000 acres of rugged terrain, but I knew the remote sections better than most. I had hiked every major trail system, camped in the deepest hollows, and prided myself on being able to navigate the wilderness even when GPS failed in the thick canopy. My job required me to check on the more isolated camping areas where serious backpackers went to escape civilization completely. Black Rock Trail was one of those places where you might not see another human being for days. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late October. 3 college friends from the University of Kentucky had been reported missing by their families after failing to return from a planned 5-day backpacking trip on Black Rock Trail. Emma, Ava, and Sophia were all experienced hikers in their early 20s, members of their university outdoor club who had been planning this trip for months. Their families provided me with detailed itineraries the girls had left behind, showing they planned to hike 12 miles into the wilderness to a remote camping area near Chimney Rock Overlook. I had met these 3 young women briefly at the trailhead office 3 days earlier when they picked up their backcountry permits. They were well prepared, carrying proper gear, and seemed knowledgeable about wilderness safety. Emma, the apparent leader of the group, had asked intelligent questions about water sources and weather patterns. Ava had studied the topographical maps carefully, marking their planned route with precision. Sophia had been quiet but attentive, checking and rechecking her equipment list. Nothing about their preparation raised any red flags for an experienced ranger like myself. The search began immediately. I led a team of 4 other rangers and 2 volunteer search and rescue members up Black Rock Trail, following the route the missing hikers had planned to take. The trail winds through some of the most isolated terrain in the forest, climbing steadily through dense hardwood forests before reaching the rocky outcroppings that give the trail its name. During peak fall foliage season, it should have been stunning, but that morning the mountains felt different somehow, heavier, more watchful. We reached their planned campsite area after 6 hours of hiking. What we found there defied every protocol I had learned in my ranger training. The campsite was completely undisturbed, as if the three women had simply vanished into thin air. Their tent was still standing, properly staked and organized. Their backpacks hung neatly from bear cables exactly as they should. Sleeping bags were rolled and stored correctly. Camp chairs were arranged in a perfect circle around a cold fire ring that showed no evidence of recent use. But it was the arrangement of their personal items that made my skin crawl. On a flat boulder near the tent, someone had carefully arranged the women's personal belongings in precise geometric patterns. Emma's journal lay open at the exact center, surrounded by Ava's compass, Sophia's headlamp, and various other items placed at mathematically perfect intervals. The arrangement looked deliberate, ritualistic almost, like some kind of offering or message that none of us could interpret. I called in additional search teams that afternoon. Within 24 hours, we had 30 people combing the area in expanding grids, following every possible route the missing hikers might have taken. We brought in tracking dogs, but the animals behaved strangely near the campsite, whining and refusing to follow any scent trails. The lead dog, a German shepherd named Rex, who had found dozens of missing persons over his career, actually cowered and tried to retreat when his handler brought him close to the arranged personal items. The strangest incidents began on the second day of searching. Electronic equipment started malfunctioning without explanation. GPS units would show impossible readings, claiming we were hundreds of miles from our actual location. Compasses spun wildly, pointing in different directions every few seconds. Two-way radios produced only static when we tried to communicate between search teams. Even analog equipment failed us. Traditional magnetic compasses that had worked perfectly for years suddenly became unreliable in a roughly 2-mile radius around the campsite. That evening, while establishing a base camp for the search operation, I discovered something that changed everything. Hidden inside Emma's journal, I found loose pages that had been carefully torn out and folded. The handwriting was Emma's, but the tone was completely different from her earlier entries about hiking routes and weather conditions. These pages described being followed by what she called tall shadows between the trees that seemed to move independently of any light source. The entries, dated just 2 days before their disappearance, became increasingly frantic. Emma wrote about hearing footsteps that perfectly matched their hiking pace, always staying just outside visual range. She described the sensation of being constantly watched by unseen observers who seemed to communicate through subtle changes in wind patterns and bird calls. Most disturbing was her final entry, written apparently on their last night at the campsite. She described waking at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of children singing hymns in what she called dead languages that somehow felt familiar. Ava's compass, part of the arranged items on the boulder, had been modified in a way none of us could explain. Someone had carefully scratched symbols into the metal housing, symbols that looked like a mixture of Cherokee petroglyphs and something much older. The compass needle had been bent into a perfect spiral shape that should have made it completely useless, yet it still moved as if responding to some magnetic force none of our instruments could detect. On the third day of searching, I made contact with Tyler, an elderly Cherokee man who lived in a cabin about 8 miles from the search area. Tyler had been born and raised in these mountains, and his family had lived here for generations before the land became a national forest. When I described the arranged personal items and the strange compass modifications, his expression changed completely. He told me about something he called the Watchers, entities his grandfather had warned him about as a child. According to Tyler, the Watchers were guardians of certain sacred places in the mountains, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds became thin. They took people during the new moon, not to harm them, but to recruit them for some purpose his grandfather had never fully explained. The arranged personal items were apparently messages, communications in a symbolic language that predated written Cherokee by thousands of years. The modified compass was meant to point not toward magnetic north, but toward what Tyler called the true direction. I should have dismissed Tyler's stories as folklore, but too many details matched what we had observed. The timing aligned perfectly with the new moon. The geometric arrangements of personal items followed patterns Tyler recognized from his grandfather's teachings. Most unsettling was Tyler's warning that search teams should not remain in the area after sunset during the new moon phase, because the watchers would consider us potential candidates for the same fate as the missing hikers. We continued searching for 6 more days, expanding our search radius to cover nearly 50 square miles of wilderness. We found no trace of Emma, Ava, or Sophia. No footprints beyond their campsite. No torn clothing or dropped equipment. No signs of struggle or animal predation. 3 experienced hikers had simply vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their perfectly arranged campsite and that spiraled compass pointing toward some destination none of us could comprehend. The official report classified their disappearance as lost in wilderness due to unknown circumstances. The families received death certificates after the standard 7-year waiting period. The campsite was quietly closed to public access, officially due to trail maintenance issues that never seemed to get resolved. But I knew the truth was far more complex and disturbing than any official explanation could capture. After completing my own research into historical records, I discovered that similar disappearances had been documented in the Black Rock Trail area dating back to the early 1800s. Settlers, surveyors, hunters, and hikers had vanished under nearly identical circumstances roughly every 7 to 10 years. Always during the new moon. Always leaving behind mysteriously arranged personal belongings. Always without any trace of what had happened to them. The psychological toll of the search eventually forced me to transfer to a different national forest in Colorado. But even now, years later, I still wake up at 3:17 a.m. sometimes, convinced I can hear children singing hymns in languages that died out centuries ago. I never returned to Black Rock Trail, and I never will. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved by people like me. Some places in these ancient mountains hold secrets that are far older and more powerful than our modern understanding of reality can accommodate. Emma, Ava, and Sophia are still out there somewhere, in whatever dimension or existence the Watchers inhabit. I hope they found peace in whatever purpose they now serve, and I hope that sharing this story might prevent other hikers from experiencing the same fate on trails where the shadows move independently of any earthly light source. It had been a peaceful hunting season for me back then. I was living alone in a cabin near Devil's Backbone Ridge in eastern Tennessee, spending my days tracking deer and my evenings by the fire with a good book. My name was Jonathan, and at 28 I considered myself an experienced outdoorsman who had been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to hold a rifle. The ridge got its name from the jagged rock formations that ran along its spine like the vertebrae of some massive prehistoric beast. And local folklore claimed it was haunted by things that were older than human memory. I had planned a week-long solo hunting trip in late November, deep into the wilderness where most hunters never ventured. The area was accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest for nearly 8 miles before reaching the remote valley where I intended to set up camp. This particular section of the mountains had a reputation among locals for being unlucky, but I had always dismissed such talk as superstition designed to keep competition away from the best hunting grounds. My campsite was situated in a small clearing surrounded by towering oak and hickory trees, with Devil's Backbone Ridge looming above me like a natural fortress. The ridge itself was a granite outcropping that rose nearly 500 feet above the valley floor. its jagged peaks visible against the sky during daylight hours. At night, those same peaks became dark silhouettes that seemed to shift and move in ways that played tricks on the eyes. I had camped in similar locations dozens of times before, but something about this place felt different from the moment I arrived. The first night passed without incident, though I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted somehow. No owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, none of the typical nocturnal activity that characterizes healthy woodland ecosystems. The silence was so complete that it felt oppressive, as if every living creature in the area had fled or gone into hiding. I attributed this to the approaching winter weather and settled into my sleeping bag without giving it much additional thought. The second night was when the screaming started. Around 2:30 a.m., I was awakened by the most inhuman sound I had ever heard. It echoed through the valley like the cry of some massive predator, but unlike any animal I could identify. The sound was deep and guttural, yet had an almost musical quality that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. My first thought was that it might be a wildcat or even a bear, but the pitch and volume were far beyond anything those animals could produce. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, scanning the tree line around my campsite for any sign of movement. The screaming continued intermittently for nearly an hour, seeming to come from different directions each time, as if whatever was making the sound was circling my position at a distance. Between the screams, I could hear what sounded like enormous footsteps crashing through the forest, breaking branches and crushing undergrowth with a weight that suggested something far larger than any known mountain animal. When morning came, I decided to investigate the source of the disturbance. Following the sounds from the previous night, I hiked about half a mile from my campsite toward the base of Devil's Backbone Ridge. What I found there defied every rational explanation I could conceive. Massive claw marks had been gouged into the bark of several mature oak trees, marks that started nearly 12 feet above the ground and extended down to chest height. The gouges were at least 4 inches deep and spaced in a pattern that suggested claws the size of railroad spikes. More disturbing were the deer carcasses I discovered scattered throughout the area. 7 white-tailed deer, all adult animals, had been killed and partially consumed in what appeared to be a feeding frenzy. But these were not normal predator kills. The carcasses had been completely drained of blood, leaving behind only pale, desiccated remains that looked like they had been mummified rather than eaten. The bodies were arranged in a rough circle around a large flat boulder, as if they had been placed there deliberately rather than killed where they fell. That afternoon, I made the decision to break camp and return to civilization. Whatever was responsible for the claw marks and deer kills was clearly dangerous, and I had no desire to encounter it during another night alone in the wilderness. But as I began packing my equipment, I realized that something was watching me from the ridge above. I could feel eyes on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, though I could see nothing when I looked up at the granite outcroppings. The feeling of being observed became overwhelming as I worked to disassemble my campsite. Every few minutes, I would stop and scan the surrounding forest, certain that I was about to see some massive predator emerging from the trees. But the forest remained empty and silent, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. By the time I had loaded my backpack and prepared to hike out, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. I had traveled less than 2 miles down the trail when I discovered that my carefully planned escape route had been blocked. A massive oak tree, easily 4 feet in diameter, had fallen across the trail in a location where it would be impossible to climb over or go around. The tree appeared to have been freshly felled, its leaves still green and its trunk still bleeding sap. But there was no evidence of wind damage or disease that would explain why such a healthy tree had suddenly toppled. More unsettling was the realization that the tree had fallen in a perfectly straight line across the trail, as if it had been deliberately placed there to prevent passage. The breakpoint showed evidence of what looked like claw marks, similar to those I had observed on the standing trees near my campsite. Something with enormous strength had apparently pushed or pulled the tree down to create an impassable barrier. With my primary exit route blocked, I was forced to attempt an alternate path through unmarked wilderness that I had never explored before. Using my compass and topographical map, I plotted a course that would take me roughly parallel to the blocked trail before rejoining it several miles downstream. But as I began hiking through the dense forest, I noticed that my compass was behaving erratically, spinning wildly and pointing in impossible directions that contradicted the position of the sun. The terrain itself seemed to be working against me. Paths that had appeared passable from a distance proved to be blocked by impenetrable thickets or impassable ravines. Creek beds that my map indicated should have been dry were flowing with fast-moving water that made crossing dangerous. Landmarks that should have been visible were somehow obscured by mist or fog that appeared and disappeared without meteorological explanation. By late afternoon, I was forced to admit that I was completely lost in an area where I should have been able to navigate easily. The mountains around me looked unfamiliar despite my years of experience in the region. The sun seemed to be setting in the wrong direction, and the shadows fell at angles that made no geometric sense. I was beginning to suspect that whatever force inhabited Devil's Backbone Ridge was actively manipulating the environment to prevent my escape. As darkness fell, I had no choice but to make an emergency camp in a small clearing barely large enough for my sleeping bag. I built a large fire using all the dry wood I could gather, knowing that flame was my only protection against whatever was stalking me through the forest. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. That night, the entity finally revealed itself. Around midnight, I was feeding more wood to my fire when I noticed a massive shadow moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the firelight, but as I watched, the shadow detached itself from the darkness and stepped into the circle of illumination cast by my campfire. The creature that emerged from the forest was unlike anything in recorded natural history. It stood nearly 10 feet tall on two powerful legs, with a body that seemed to be a hybrid of human and bear characteristics. Its arms were enormously long and muscular, ending in hands that bore the massive claws I had seen evidence of throughout the forest. The head was vaguely humanoid but elongated, with eyes that reflected the firelight like polished mirrors and a mouth filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh. Most terrifying was its obvious intelligence. This was not a mindless predator acting on instinct, but a thinking entity that had been systematically hunting me since my arrival on its territory. It circled my campfire slowly, studying me with the same careful attention a scientist might give to a laboratory specimen. When it spoke, its voice was a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The words were in no language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. The creature was claiming ownership of Devil's Backbone Ridge and everything within its boundaries. I was trespassing on sacred ground, and the penalty for such violation was death. But it offered me a choice. I could serve as its messenger, returning to the human world to warn others away from this place, or I could join the deer whose drained carcasses decorated its feeding ground. I chose to live. The creature allowed me to gather my essential gear and led me through the forest along paths that had been invisible during daylight hours. Within 2 hours, I found myself standing beside a paved road nearly 15 miles from where I thought I had been camping. A passing motorist picked me up and drove me to the nearest town, where I called friends to retrieve my vehicle from the original trailhead. The local sheriff listened politely to my report, but clearly believed I had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. No search teams were sent to investigate the creature or recover the deer carcasses I had described. The section of Devil's Backbone Ridge where I had encountered the entity was quietly reclassified as a protected wildlife area that would remain permanently closed to hunting and camping. I never returned to that part of the mountains, and I strongly advise others to respect the boundaries that have been established around Devil's Backbone Ridge. Some places in these ancient mountains are home to forces that predate human civilization, entities that have their own laws and their own methods of enforcement. The creature that hunts those ridges is not evil in any human sense, but it is absolutely territorial and utterly without mercy for those who violate the sanctity of its domain. The nightmares stopped eventually, but I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, certain that I can hear that inhuman screaming echoing through valleys hundreds of miles away. And I know that somewhere in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, something ancient and powerful continues to guard its territory against intruders who lack the wisdom to recognize the signs that mark truly dangerous ground. The night everything changed was a Friday in October 1987. I was 24, working as a county clerk in Harlan County, Kentucky, when I stumbled across documents that revealed a massacre had been covered up for decades. My name was Emma then, and I had taken the job at the courthouse because it seemed like stable work in a region where good jobs were scarce. Harlan County had a reputation for violence dating back to the Coal Wars of the 1930s, but by the 1980s, most people assumed those dark days were ancient history. I had been working late that Friday evening trying to catch up on filing court records that had been neglected by my predecessor. The basement storage room of the Harlan County Courthouse contained thousands of boxes filled with legal documents dating back to the early 1900s. Most of it was routine paperwork, property deeds, marriage licenses, and civil court cases that held little interest for anyone except historians and genealogists. But buried in a mislabeled box marked Property Records 1955 to 1960, I discovered a sealed manila envelope that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The envelope contained photographs, witness statements, and official reports related to what the documents called the Pine Mountain Incident of September 1954. According to the public records I had access to, the Pine Mountain Incident was a shootout between two rival moonshine families that had resulted in 6 deaths. The official story, reported in newspapers and repeated in local histories, described it as a tragic but typical example of the mountain feuds that had plagued eastern Kentucky for generations. The Whitman family and the Crawford family had been fighting over territory rights for illegal whiskey production, and the conflict had escalated into deadly violence. But the documents in that sealed envelope told a completely different story. The witness statements, signed under oath and notarized by officials whose names I recognized from courthouse records, described the systematic murder of 23 people, including women and children as young as 5 years old. The victims were not just members of the feuding families, but also uninvolved neighbors, a traveling preacher, and 2 federal revenue agents who had been investigating moonshine operations in the area. The photographs were the most disturbing evidence I had ever seen. Black and white images showing bodies arranged in what appeared to be execution-style killings. Entire families gunned down in their homes, including elderly grandparents and infants. The carnage was methodical and brutal, suggesting not a spontaneous shootout, but a carefully planned massacre designed to eliminate all potential witnesses to whatever the real conflict had been about. According to the witness statements, the violence had been orchestrated by neither the Whitman nor Crawford families, but by outside interests connected to organized crime syndicates from Louisville and Cincinnati. These criminal organizations had been attempting to take control of the lucrative moonshine trade in eastern Kentucky, and the local families had been resisting their efforts to establish monopoly control over the region. The massacre was designed to send a message that resistance would not be tolerated. Most shocking was the revelation of official complicity in the cover-up. Sheriff's Department reports showed that local law enforcement had arrived at the scene within hours of the killings, but instead of investigating the murders, they had participated in disposing of evidence and concealing the true scope of the violence. Federal agents had also been present, apparently working in cooperation with the criminal syndicates rather than investigating them. The bodies of 17 victims had been secretly buried in an abandoned coal mine shaft about 5 miles from the scene of the killings. The remaining 6 victims were the only ones officially acknowledged, their deaths attributed to the fictional shootout between local families. The witness statements included detailed descriptions of the burial site, complete with hand-drawn maps showing the exact location of the mass grave. I spent the entire weekend studying the documents, cross-referencing names and dates with other courthouse records, every detail checked out perfectly. The witnesses were real people whose signatures appeared on numerous other legal documents from the same time period. The officials who had signed the reports were legitimate law enforcement officers and federal agents whose careers I could trace through personnel records. The photographs showed landscapes and buildings that I could identify as actual locations in Harlan County. On Monday morning, I approached my supervisor, Janet Morrison, who had been working at the courthouse for over 30 years. When I showed her the documents, her reaction was immediate and terrifying. She snatched the envelope from my hands and ordered me to forget everything I had seen. When I protested that we had a legal obligation to report evidence of unsolved murders, she explained that those particular files were classified and should never have been accessible to someone with my security clearance. Janet revealed that she had known about the Pine Mountain Massacre for years, as had several other long-term courthouse employees. The cover-up had been maintained through a combination of official secrecy, family connections, and simple fear of retaliation. Many of the families involved in the original incident still lived in Harlan County, and some had risen to positions of power in local government and law enforcement. Exposing the truth would implicate prominent citizens who had built their careers on maintaining the official version of events. But I could not simply ignore what I had discovered. Over the next several weeks, I began quietly researching the descendants of the victims, many of whom still lived in the area. I contacted elderly residents who had been alive in 1954, asking carefully worded questions about their memories of that time period. What I learned confirmed and expanded the information in the official documents. Several family members told me stories that had been passed down through generations about relatives who had gone missing in September 1954. These disappearances had never been officially investigated, but the families had always suspected foul play. Some described receiving anonymous threats warning them not to ask questions about their missing relatives. Others mentioned federal agents visiting their homes in the months following the incident, pressuring them to sign documents stating that their relatives had left the area voluntarily. The most valuable information came from Martha Whitman, an 84-year-old woman whose uncle had been among the massacre victims. Martha had been 16 years old in 1954 and had witnessed part of the violence firsthand. She described seeing men in federal badges working alongside known criminals to execute her neighbors. She had hidden in a root cellar for 2 days while the killings and cleanup operation continued, and had observed the removal of bodies to the abandoned mine shaft. Martha also provided me with a crucial piece of evidence that was not included in the courthouse documents. Her uncle had given her a small notebook containing names, dates, and financial records related to the moonshine operations. The notebook showed payments being made to federal agents and local law enforcement officers, proving the existence of systematic corruption that extended far beyond Harlan County. She had kept the notebook hidden for over 30 years, too frightened to show it to anyone in authority. Armed with this additional evidence, I decided to contact state law enforcement agencies that might be willing to investigate the cover-up. But within days of making my first phone calls, I began receiving anonymous threats. Someone left dead animals on my doorstep with notes warning me to stop digging up old graves. My car tires were slashed repeatedly. Anonymous callers would phone my home at all hours, playing recordings of gunshots and screaming. The harassment escalated when I attempted to visit the abandoned mine shaft where the victims were supposedly buried. I drove to the location indicated on the maps in the courthouse documents, accompanied by a friend who served as a witness. We found the mine entrance exactly where the documents indicated, sealed with concrete but showing signs of recent disturbance. While we were examining the site, 3 men in Sheriff's Department uniforms arrived and ordered us to leave immediately. One of the deputies was the nephew of the current sheriff, James Crawford, whose family name was the same as one of the moonshine families mentioned in the original cover-up documents. He made it clear that we were trespassing on private property, and that any attempt to excavate or investigate the area would result in serious criminal charges. The implicit threat was obvious. The same families who had participated in the 1954 cover-up were still in positions of power and still committed to maintaining their version of events. My situation became untenable when the harassment extended to my family. Someone broke into my parents' home while they were at church, ransacking their belongings but stealing nothing of value. Instead, they left behind photographs of the Pine Mountain Massacre victims with my face superimposed over the corpses. The message was unmistakable. If I continued investigating, I would meet the same fate as those who had been silenced in 1954. The final straw came when I discovered that my personnel file at the courthouse had been altered to include false allegations of drug use and theft. Janet Morrison informed me that I was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into my erratic behavior and possible substance abuse problems. It was clear that my job would be terminated and my reputation destroyed if I did not abandon my investigation immediately. That weekend, I made the difficult decision to leave Harlan County permanently. I photocopied all the documents I had access to and mailed copies to journalists and federal investigators, though I never learned whether any of them pursued the story. I packed my belongings and moved to Ohio, where I found work in a completely different field and tried to rebuild my life far from the mountains where 23 people had been murdered and forgotten. Years later, I learned that the courthouse basement had suffered a flood shortly after my departure, destroying thousands of historical documents, including the entire box where I had discovered the Pine Mountain Massacre files. The abandoned mine shaft had been permanently sealed with additional concrete and declared a hazardous waste site that would remain off-limits indefinitely. Martha Whitman died of natural causes 6 months after our conversation, and her nephew reported that someone had burglarized her home and stolen all her family documents. The official story of the Pine Mountain incident remains unchanged in historical records. 6 people died in a moonshine feud in September 1954, according to newspaper archives and local histories. The 17 additional victims who were secretly buried in that mine shaft will never receive proper burials or official recognition. Their families still live with unanswered questions and unresolved grief, but they understand that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud in communities where the perpetrator's descendants still hold power. I never returned to Eastern Kentucky, and I never will. Some secrets are maintained through violence that spans generations, and some cover-ups are too deeply entrenched to be exposed by individuals working alone. The mountains of Appalachia hold many such secrets buried in abandoned mine shafts and protected by families who have built their prosperity on the silence of the dead. Most people move to small Appalachian towns for the peace and quiet, maybe to escape city life or find themselves in the simplicity of mountain living. That was all I wanted when I took the teaching job in Millfield Hollow, West Virginia, population 847 according to the faded welcome sign that greeted visitors at the single road leading into town. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education, and desperate enough for work that I accepted the position without even visiting the school first. The pay was terrible, but the cost of living was practically nothing, and I figured a year or two in rural West Virginia would give me the experience I needed to land a better job in a real city. Nicholas was my name then, though the children at Millfield Hollow Elementary School never called me anything but teacher. The school building itself was older than my grandparents, a 2-story brick structure that had been educating mountain children since 1923. 26 students total, grades kindergarten through 8th, all crammed into 3 classrooms with me and 2 other teachers. The principal, Mrs. Garrett, was a stern woman in her 60s who had been running the school for over 30 years and made it clear that outsiders like me needed to learn the local ways quickly or find employment elsewhere. My first warning sign should have been the children themselves. Rural mountain kids are usually shy around strangers, but these children exhibited behaviors I had never encountered in any education textbook. They moved in perfect synchronization during transitions, walking in single-file lines without being instructed, sitting down simultaneously without any verbal cues. During morning prayer time, which Mrs. Garrett insisted was a cherished local tradition, the children would recite verses that sounded like standard Christian prayers but contained phrases I could not identify in any Bible I had ever read. The drawings were what truly disturbed me. As part of my art curriculum, I had the children create self-portraits during my 2nd week of teaching. Every single drawing, from the 5-year-old kindergartners to the 14-year-old 8th graders, contained the same symbols worked into the background. Intricate geometric patterns that resembled a mixture of Celtic knots and something much more ancient. When I asked about the symbols, the children would smile politely and explain that they were protection marks their families had taught them to include in all their artwork. Mrs. Garrett was no help when I brought my concerns to her attention. She dismissed my observations as the natural adjustment period all outside teachers experienced when working with traditional mountain families. She explained that Millfield Hollow had been settled by a close-knit religious community in the early 1900s, and that many of the current families were direct descendants of those original settlers. The children were simply reflecting the strong cultural heritage that had been passed down through generations of mountain folk who valued tradition above all else. But the more I researched the history of Millfield Hollow, the more disturbing the truth became. The original settlement had been established in 1919 by a religious group called the Covenant of the Sacred Blood, led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Blackwood. Historical records from the county courthouse showed that the commune had practiced what contemporary accounts described as unorthodox religious rituals that had drawn investigation from both state authorities and mainstream Christian denominations. The group had apparently disbanded sometime in the 1920s after allegations of child abuse and animal sacrifice. But the families had remained in the hollow and continued their isolated lifestyle. The children's behavior became increasingly unsettling as the weeks progressed. During reading time, they would occasionally speak in perfect unison, reciting passages that were not in any of our textbooks. The words sounded like a mixture of Appalachian dialect and Latin phrases, delivered in a rhythmic cadence that felt more like chanting than reading. When I tried to correct them or ask where they had learned these passages, they would look at me with identical expressions of polite confusion, as if they had no memory of speaking at all. The breaking point came during my 6th week of teaching. While cleaning up after art class, I discovered that several of the older students had been carving symbols into their wooden desks. The same geometric patterns from their drawings, but carved deep enough to leave permanent marks in the wood. More disturbing was the fact that the carvings appeared to be intentionally hidden under layers of paper and books, suggesting the children knew their actions would not be approved by outside observers. That evening, I decided to explore the area around the school building to better understand the community I was serving. The school sat at the center of the hollow, surrounded by the small homes where most of my students lived with their families. As darkness fell, I noticed lights beginning to flicker on in the windows of these homes. But the lights seemed to move in coordinated patterns, as if the families were communicating through some kind of visual signal system. Around 11:30 p.m., I watched from my small apartment above the school as families began emerging from their homes. Adults and children alike, all dressed in dark clothing, walking silently toward the abandoned coal mine shaft that sat about half a mile up the mountainside. They carried no flashlights or lanterns, but seemed to navigate the rough terrain with supernatural confidence despite the moonless night. My rational mind told me to stay inside and mind my own business, but something compelled me to follow at a distance. The abandoned mine entrance had been sealed with concrete and warning signs decades earlier, but someone had created a hidden passage through what appeared to be a natural cave opening about 50 yards to the left of the official entrance. The families disappeared into this opening one by one, and I could see the faint glow of candlelight emanating from deep within the mountain. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I crept closer until I could hear what was happening inside the cave. The sound that emerged from the depths was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Dozens of voices, including the unmistakable sounds of my students chanting in that same mixture of Appalachian dialect and Latin that I had heard in the classroom. But this was different, more intense, more purposeful. The chanting built to crescendos that seemed to make the very mountain vibrate, followed by periods of absolute silence that felt more ominous than the loudest sounds. Then came the animal sounds, bleating, squealing, and finally silence. The metallic smell of blood began to drift out of the cave entrance, carried by warm air currents that should not have existed in an abandoned mine shaft. My hands were shaking as I realized I was witnessing some kind of ritual sacrifice, and my students were active participants rather than innocent victims. The ceremony continued for what felt like hours. I crouched behind a fallen tree, too terrified to retreat but unable to stop watching. Around 3 a.m., the families began emerging from the cave, moving with the same silent coordination they had displayed earlier. But something had changed. The children, including several of my youngest students, carried themselves differently. Their posture was more adult, more confident, as if they had undergone some kind of transformation during the underground ritual. I made it back to my apartment without being discovered, but sleep was impossible. The next morning, I arrived at school early, hoping to find some rational explanation for what I had witnessed. The children behaved exactly as they always had, polite and attentive, showing no signs of fatigue despite their late-night activities. But when I looked closely at their hands during morning activities, I could see faint stains under their fingernails that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Mrs. Garrett arrived at school that morning with a knowing smile that chilled me to the bone. She invited me into her office for what she called a community orientation discussion. Without any preamble, she explained that I had been observed during the previous night's activities, and that the community now needed to decide whether I was suitable for long-term integration into their traditions, or whether I represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. She spoke matter-of-factly about the covenant of the sacred blood, which she revealed had never actually disbanded but had simply become more secretive after unwanted attention from outside authorities. The current families were indeed descendants of the original commune, members, and they continued to practice what she called the old ways that predated Christianity by thousands of years. The rituals I had witnessed were monthly observances designed to maintain spiritual protection for the Hollow and ensure the continued prosperity of their isolated community. The children, Mrs. Garrett explained, were initiated into the covenant practices from birth, learning the sacred symbols and incantations as naturally as they learned to walk and talk. The blood rituals involving animal sacrifice were considered essential for maintaining the spiritual barriers that kept their community hidden from the outside world. She spoke about federal authorities and social services as if they were invading armies that could only be repelled through supernatural means. Most terrifying was her casual revelation that 3 previous teachers had been hired over the past decade, all of whom had discovered the community's secret practices. 2 had been successfully converted and had chosen to remain in Millfield Hollow permanently, abandoning their previous lives to become full members of the Covenant. The 3rd teacher had attempted to contact outside authorities and had suffered what Mrs. Garrett described as an unfortunate accident while hiking alone in the mountains. She gave me 48 hours to decide whether I wanted to undergo the initiation process and become a permanent member of their community, or whether I preferred to leave Millfield Hollow and never speak about what I had witnessed. The implied threat was crystal clear. Those were my only 2 options. There would be no 3rd choice involving law enforcement or social services. I spent that night packing my belongings and planning my escape route. But when I went to start my car the next morning, I discovered that someone had vandalized it during the night. All 4 tires had been slashed, the engine compartment had been filled with dead animals arranged in those same geometric patterns the children drew, and a message had been carved into my windshield in what appeared to be the same symbols from the mine ritual. The nearest phone service was 12 miles away, and the single road out of Millfield Hollow wound through isolated mountain terrain where a person could easily disappear without a trace. I realized that the community had effectively trapped me while I made my decision about joining their covenant or facing the same accident that had befallen my predecessor. That night, I made my choice. Rather than wait for Mrs. Garrett's deadline, I abandoned my belongings and fled on foot through the mountain forests, navigating by stars and following creek beds until I reached a state highway where I could flag down help from a passing trucker. I never returned to collect my things or submit a formal resignation. I simply disappeared from Millfield Hollow the same way I had arrived, like a brief interruption in their centuries-old isolation. Years later, I learned that Millfield Hollow Elementary School had closed permanently due to declining enrollment. But I knew the real reason was that the community had decided to eliminate all outside contact entirely. The families still live in that hidden valley, still practicing their blood rituals under the moonless nights, still raising their children to carry on traditions that most of the world believes died out long ago. And somewhere in that abandoned mine shaft, the covenant of the sacred blood continues its ancient work of keeping the outside world at bay through means that most people would never believe possible. I never taught school again after leaving West Virginia. Some experiences change you in ways that make returning to normal life impossible. But I sometimes wonder about those children, now adults themselves, still gathering in that underground chamber to chant in languages that predate recorded history, still carving their protection symbols into everything they touch, still maintaining their supernatural isolation through rituals that would horrify anyone who witnessed them. The old ways persist in places like Millfield Hollow, hidden in mountain communities where the modern world has never truly penetrated, where blood and tradition matter more than law and civilization. I need to tell someone about what happened in Copper Creek, Virginia, because keeping it inside is eating me alive. I was 31, working as a social worker in the rural mountain communities where children were disappearing without explanation. My name was Ava, and I had taken the job with the State Department of Social Services because I genuinely believed I could make a difference in the lives of vulnerable mountain families who had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Copper Creek was one of those communities that time seemed to have bypassed entirely. Nestled in a narrow valley between steep ridges in southwestern Virginia, The settlement consisted of maybe 40 families scattered along a winding dirt road that followed the creek for about 5 miles. Most of the residents lived in mobile homes or small frame houses that had seen better decades, and the majority survived on disability payments, seasonal work, or whatever they could earn from the underground economy that flourished in areas where legitimate employment was scarce. The first disappearance I investigated was 8-year-old Kevin Morrison, who vanished from his family's trailer on a Tuesday night in March. His grandmother, who had been caring for him while his parents worked night shifts at a poultry processing plant, reported that Kevin had gone to bed normally around 9 o'clock but was gone when she checked on him at midnight. The trailer door was unlocked, Kevin's shoes were missing from beside his bed, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. What made Kevin's disappearance particularly disturbing was the behavior described by his grandmother in the weeks leading up to that night. Kevin had become increasingly withdrawn and secretive, spending hours talking to himself in his room and drawing pictures of robed figures standing in circles around children. When his grandmother asked about the drawings, Kevin would only say that the church people had been teaching him about special children who were chosen by God for important work. Within 6 weeks of Kevin's disappearance, 2 more children had vanished under similar circumstances. 9-year-old Olivia Patterson disappeared from her family's cabin while her parents slept in the next room. Her shoes were missing, the door was unlocked, and neighbors reported seeing a small figure walking down the mountain road around 3 in the morning. 12-year-old Tyler Hayes vanished from his bedroom in a house where his grandfather was supposedly keeping watch. Same pattern, no signs of struggle, missing shoes, unlocked door. The local sheriff's department treated each case as a runaway situation despite the children's young ages and the identical circumstances of their disappearances. Sheriff Wade Hendricks, a man whose family had lived in the area for 4 generations, insisted that mountain children often wandered off and that they would eventually return on their own or be found by search teams. But no search teams were ever organized, and no serious investigation was conducted into the possibility that the disappearances were connected. As the social worker assigned to these cases, I began conducting my own investigation into the common factors that might explain why these particular children had been targeted. All 3 families were isolated, living at least a mile from their nearest neighbors. All 3 children had been described by their families as acting strangely in the weeks before they disappeared, becoming secretive and withdrawn. And all 3 families mentioned that their children had been attending a traveling Sunday school ministry that visited the area once a month. The ministry was called Children of the Sacred Promise, and it was run by a charismatic preacher named Brother Marcus, who traveled throughout the rural mountain communities of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky in a converted school bus painted with biblical scenes. Brother Marcus claimed to have a special calling to minister to children in isolated communities where traditional churches were scarce, and he focused particularly on children from troubled or broken homes. I attended one of Brother Marcus's services at a community center in Copper Creek, posing as a potential volunteer interested in helping with his ministry. What I witnessed disturbed me far more than I had expected. Brother Marcus possessed an almost hypnotic ability to capture and hold the attention of children, speaking to them in a soft, melodious voice about being chosen ones who were destined for special service to God. During the service, Brother Marcus separated the children from their parents, leading them into a back room for what he called special instruction, while the adults remained in the main hall for prayer and testimony. I managed to position myself near the door of the back room and overheard portions of Brother Marcus's conversation with the children. He was telling them about children throughout history who had been called to leave their families and serve God in special ways, comparing them to Samuel in the Old Testament, who had been given to the temple as a young child. More disturbing was Brother Marcus's emphasis on secrecy. He repeatedly told the children that their special calling must be kept secret from their parents and other adults who might not understand God's plan for them. He taught them coded phrases and hand signals that would identify them to other chosen ones, and instructed them to watch for signs that their time of calling was approaching. After the service, I approached several parents to ask about their children's involvement with Brother Marcus's ministry. Most were enthusiastic about the positive influence they believed he was having on their children. Several mentioned that their children had become more religious and well-behaved since attending the services, and they credited Brother Marcus with giving their children a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from their lives. But when I spoke with the children themselves, I detected an undercurrent of fear and confusion that their parents seemed oblivious to. The children who had attended multiple services with Brother Marcus spoke about him with a mixture of reverence and terror, as if he possessed some kind of supernatural authority over them. They used the coded phrases he had taught them when speaking to each other, and they displayed knowledge of biblical stories and concepts that seemed far beyond their educational level. My investigation took a darker turn when I discovered that Brother Marcus had been operating under different names and identities throughout Appalachia for at least 2 decades. Court records from West Virginia showed that a man matching his description had been arrested in 1987 on charges of child endangerment and running an unlicensed boarding school, but he had disappeared before trial. Similar incidents were documented in Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, always involving a traveling preacher who specialized in ministering to children from isolated mountain families. The pattern was consistent across all these cases. Brother Marcus, or whatever his real name was, would establish a presence in a remote community, gain the trust of local families through his charismatic religious services, identify vulnerable children who could be separated from their support systems, and then systematically prepare these children for removal from their families under the guise of religious calling. When I attempted to share my findings with Sheriff Hendricks, his reaction was immediate and hostile. He accused me of harassing a respected man of God and threatened to have me charged with interfering with a criminal investigation if I continued pursuing what he called wild conspiracy theories. He made it clear that Brother Marcus enjoyed the protection of several influential families in the county, including some who were related to law enforcement officers. My persistence in investigating the disappearances soon brought unwanted attention from sources far more dangerous than the local sheriff. Someone broke into my apartment and searched through my files, taking copies of everything related to Brother Marcus and the missing children. Anonymous phone calls began coming at all hours, featuring children's voices begging me to stop looking for them and promising that they were happy in their new lives. The calls were the most disturbing evidence I had encountered. The voices were definitely those of Kevin, Olivia, and Tyler, speaking in the same coded phrases that Brother Marcus had taught them. But the children sounded different somehow, older and more serious, as if they had been trained to deliver these messages. They spoke about being part of a larger family now, about serving God in ways their birth families could never understand, and about the importance of other chosen children joining them soon. When I tried to trace the source of these calls, I discovered that they were coming from payphones scattered across multiple states, always in rural areas near communities where Brother Marcus had been reported operating. The timing suggested a coordinated effort to monitor my investigation and discourage me from continuing my work. But the involvement of the missing children themselves implied something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping operation. My attempts to contact federal law enforcement agencies were unsuccessful. The FBI office in Richmond listened politely to my concerns, but explained that they could not investigate a traveling ministry without evidence of federal crimes being committed. Child Protective Services in other states had similar responses, noting that they had no jurisdiction over a Virginia case and that the disappearances could not be definitively linked to criminal activity. The breakthrough I had been hoping for came from an unexpected source. Martha Combs, an elderly woman who lived alone in a cabin at the head of Copper Creek Valley, approached me at the post office with information she had been afraid to share with law enforcement. Martha had been watching Brother Marcus's activities for months, and she had observed patterns that confirmed my worst fears about what was happening to the missing children. According to Martha, Brother Marcus was not working alone but was part of a network that included several families in the community who served as recruiters and facilitators for his operation. These families identified potential targets among their neighbors' children and provided Brother Marcus with detailed information about which children would be easiest to manipulate and remove without triggering serious investigation. Martha had witnessed nighttime meetings in abandoned buildings where Brother Marcus met with local collaborators to plan the removal of specific children. She had observed vehicles with out-of-state license plates arriving to transport children away from the area, and she had seen money changing hands between Brother Marcus and his local contacts. Most damning was her account of overhearing conversations about buyers in distant cities who were willing to pay substantial sums for children who met specific criteria. Armed with Martha's testimony and the evidence I had gathered from my own investigation, I made one final attempt to convince Sheriff Hendricks to take action against Brother Marcus and his network. Instead of cooperation, I received a visit from 2 deputies who informed me that I was being placed under investigation for drug possession and child endangerment based on anonymous tips from concerned citizens. The planted evidence was discovered in my apartment the next day during a search conducted while I was at work. Small quantities of methamphetamine were found hidden in my belongings, along with photographs of local children that had supposedly been taken without their parents' permission. The charges were serious enough to result in immediate suspension from my job and removal from all active cases pending a full investigation. I knew that fighting the false charges would be futile in a system where Brother Marcus enjoyed protection from law enforcement and local government officials. Instead, I gathered copies of all my evidence and fled Virginia, settling in North Carolina, where I attempted to rebuild my life and career under constant fear that Brother Marcus's network might track me down. Years later, I learned that the charges against me had been quietly dropped due to insufficient evidence. But by then, my reputation had been permanently destroyed, and no social services agency would consider hiring me. Brother Marcus continued operating throughout Appalachia for several more years before disappearing entirely, leaving behind dozens of families whose children had vanished and whose questions would never be answered by authorities who preferred to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual had occurred. The children of Copper Creek were never found, and no official investigation was ever conducted into the network that facilitated their disappearance. But I know they are still out there somewhere, still speaking in coded phrases, still believing they were chosen for special service to God, still trapped in a system that treats them as commodities rather than human beings deserving protection and love. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Sunday in June 2019. I was 26, working as a paramedic in rural North Carolina, when we got the emergency call from the Mountain Glory Holiness Church about a snake bite gone wrong. My name was Brandon, and in my 4 years of emergency medical service, I had responded to dozens of snake handling incidents at various Pentecostal churches throughout the region. Most were straightforward cases of envenomation that required immediate transport to hospitals with anti-venom supplies. But something about this particular call felt different from the moment I heard the dispatcher's voice. The Mountain Glory Holiness Church sat at the end of a winding dirt road about 12 miles outside the small town of Cedar Falls, nestled in a narrow valley between steep ridges covered in dense forest. The church building itself was a simple wooden structure painted white, with a tall steeple that could be seen from miles away during daylight hours. But approaching it at night, with emergency lights flashing through the darkness, the building looked more like something from a Gothic horror movie than a house of worship. My partner Jake and I arrived to find the church parking lot filled with pickup trucks and older cars, unusual for such an early morning hour. Even more strange was the behavior of the congregation members who met us at the door. Instead of the panic and distress I normally observed when someone had been bitten by a venomous snake, these people seemed calm, almost serene, as if the emergency was simply part of their regular worship routine. Pastor Ezekiel Whitman greeted us at the church entrance, a tall, gaunt man in his 60s with piercing gray eyes and hands that showed old scars from multiple snake bites. He explained that one of his parishioners, a young man named Tyler Hayes, had been bitten during their evening service and was experiencing an unusual reaction to the venom. But when Pastor Whitman led us inside to see the patient, what I found defied every principle of toxicology I had learned in my medical training. Tyler was conscious and alert, sitting calmly in a front pew while blood seeped from puncture wounds on his forearm. The bite marks were clearly fresh, probably inflicted within the past hour, and the swelling pattern indicated envenomation from what appeared to be a timber rattlesnake. But Tyler showed none of the symptoms I expected to see. No difficulty breathing, no nausea or vomiting, no signs of the systemic toxicity that should have been killing him by that point. When I examined Tyler more closely, I discovered that he had been bitten multiple times over many months or years. His arms and hands were covered with old bite scars in various stages of healing, some showing the distinctive necrotic tissue damage associated with venomous snake bites. Yet Tyler appeared to be in perfect health, with normal vital signs and no evidence of the organ damage that should have resulted from repeated exposures to snake venom. Pastor Whitman explained that their congregation had been blessed with divine protection from serpent venom, referring to biblical passages about believers who would handle snakes and drink poison without suffering harm. But the medical evidence I was observing suggested something far more complex than simple religious faith. These people seemed to have developed some kind of biological immunity to snake venom through repeated controlled exposure, a process that should have killed most of them long before they achieved any protective effect. While Jake prepared Tyler for transport to the hospital as a precautionary measure, I had the opportunity to observe the church interior more carefully. What I saw disturbed me far more than the snake handling itself. The walls were covered with symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian iconography and much older designs that looked vaguely occult. Serpentine patterns wound around crucifixes and biblical verses were written in languages I could not identify. Most unsettling was the basement entrance I discovered behind the altar area. Pastor Whitman quickly moved to block my view when he noticed my attention. But I had seen enough to recognize that the church contained spaces that were not visible to casual observers. The basement door was reinforced with heavy locks and warning signs that seemed excessive for a typical church storage area, and I could detect a faint chemical odor emanating from whatever lay below the main sanctuary. Tyler's hospital evaluation confirmed my suspicions that something unusual was happening at Mountain Glory Holiness Church. Blood tests showed that he had extremely high levels of antibodies to various snake venoms, indicating repeated exposure over an extended period. But more disturbing was the presence of unknown compounds in his bloodstream that the hospital laboratory could not identify. Tyler himself seemed confused when questioned about these substances, claiming no knowledge of taking any medications or supplements that might explain the test results. Over the following weeks, I began conducting discreet research into the Mountain Glory Holiness Church and Pastor Whitman's background. What I discovered painted a picture of a religious community that had evolved far beyond traditional snake handling practices into something that resembled a sophisticated biochemical experiment disguised as Christian worship. Pastor Whitman had a background in chemistry and pharmacology before entering the ministry, having worked for several years as a laboratory technician at a pharmaceutical company that specialized in developing anti-venoms. His transition to religious leadership had coincided with his acquisition of the Mountain Glory Church building, which had previously housed a veterinary clinic with laboratory facilities in its basement. The congregation members were not random rural believers, but had been carefully selected based on specific criteria that included physical fitness, social isolation, and willingness to submit to the pastor's absolute authority. Many were recent transplants to the area who had been recruited through online forums dedicated to alternative religious practices and extreme spiritual experiences. My investigation took a dangerous turn when I attempted to observe one of the church's regular evening services. Parking my vehicle in the woods about a quarter-mile from the church, I hiked through the forest to a position where I could see into the building through the windows. What I witnessed that night convinced me that the Mountain Glory Holiness Church was engaged in activities that had nothing to do with traditional Christian worship. The service began conventionally enough, with hymn singing and biblical readings that seemed consistent with Pentecostal practices. But as the evening progressed, the congregation descended into the church basement, where they engaged in rituals that combined snake handling with the consumption of various liquid substances that were definitely not communion wine. Pastor Whitman presided over ceremonies where congregation members drank what appeared to be diluted snake venom, while handling multiple venomous serpents simultaneously. The participants exhibited behavior suggesting they were in altered states of consciousness, speaking in tongues but also displaying physical capabilities that seemed superhuman. They moved with extraordinary speed and coordination, showed no fear of the dangerous snakes they were handling, and appeared to communicate with each other through subtle gestures and expressions that suggested some form of group telepathy. Most disturbing was the presence of several local officials at these underground ceremonies. I recognized the police chief, the mayor, and 2 county commissioners participating fully in the rituals, handling snakes and consuming the mysterious substances along with the regular congregation members. This explained why the Mountain Glory Church had been able to operate without interference from law enforcement, despite engaging in activities that clearly violated numerous health and safety regulations. The basement laboratory was a sophisticated operation that would have impressed legitimate researchers. Pastor Whitman had been extracting venom from dozens of different snake species and using his pharmaceutical background to create customized formulations that gradually built immunity in his followers, while also producing psychoactive effects that enhanced their religious experiences and strengthened their psychological dependence on the group. But the venom treatments were only part of the operation. Pastor Whitman had also been experimenting with blood rituals that involved the consumption of small quantities of human blood mixed with snake venom, creating a biochemical bond between congregation members that heightened their sense of group identity while making them increasingly dependent on continued participation in the ceremonies. When I attempted to document these activities with photographs taken through the basement windows, I was discovered by church security personnel who had been monitoring the surrounding area for unwanted observers. Instead of calling law enforcement, they brought me directly to Pastor Whitman, who seemed to view my investigation as an opportunity rather than a threat. Pastor Whitman explained that their religious community was engaged in what he called evolutionary Christianity, attempting to use biochemical enhancement to create a new form of human being that would be immune to physical harm and capable of direct spiritual communication with divine forces. The snake venom treatments were designed to build immunity not just to toxins but to all forms of physical and spiritual attack, while the blood rituals created permanent psychological bonds between participants that transcended individual identity. He offered me the choice of joining their community permanently or being silenced in a way that would appear to be an accidental overdose of the drugs that he claimed I had been using to cope with the stress of my paramedic work. The planted evidence was already in place in my apartment and vehicle, he explained, along with false testimony from congregation members who would swear that I had been exhibiting erratic behavior and substance abuse problems for months. I chose to live, but the price of survival was participation in their initiation ritual. Over the course of several hours, I was forced to consume graduated doses of snake venom mixed with hallucinogenic compounds, while handling increasingly dangerous serpents under Pastor Whitman's supervision. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, producing altered states of consciousness that made me understand how the congregation members could believe they were achieving divine transcendence through these practices. The biochemical effects of the initiation lasted for weeks, creating powerful cravings for additional doses of the venom compounds and generating vivid dreams in which I felt connected to some kind of collective consciousness shared by all the church members. But I also experienced severe physical side effects, including liver damage, neurological symptoms, and immune system suppression that made me realize the long-term consequences of continued participation would be fatal. Using my medical knowledge and access to hospital laboratory facilities, I was able to analyze samples of my blood and identify some of the compounds that Pastor Whitman had been administering to his followers. The formulations were sophisticated and dangerous, designed to create physical dependency, while gradually destroying the immune system and major organs of anyone who received them regularly over extended periods. Armed with this evidence, I contacted state and federal law enforcement agencies, but found that my reports were blocked by the same local officials who were participating in the church's rituals. Instead of triggering an investigation, my attempts to expose the Mountain Glory Church resulted in my termination from the paramedic service and criminal charges related to the planted drug evidence that Pastor Whitman had threatened to use against me. I was forced to leave North Carolina permanently, relocating to another state where I could rebuild my career and life without the constant threat of retaliation from Pastor Whitman's network of supporters. But I learned later that my evidence had eventually reached federal investigators who were able to conduct a raid on the Mountain Glory Church that resulted in multiple arrests and the seizure of the basement laboratory. Pastor Whitman died in federal custody before he could stand trial, officially from a heart attack, but under circumstances that suggested he may have been eliminated by other members of his network who feared he would reveal information about similar operations in other states. The church building was destroyed in a suspicious fire shortly after the raid, eliminating most of the physical evidence of what had been taking place there. The congregation members who survived the federal investigation were scattered to other communities, but I have reason to believe that some of them continue to practice the rituals they learned under Pastor Whitman's guidance. The biochemical dependency he created in his followers was designed to be permanent, and the psychological bonds formed through the blood rituals may have created a network that will persist for decades, even without centralized leadership. Most people remember 1987 in Buchanan County, Virginia, for the mine explosion that killed 12 workers. What they don't know is that those men were murdered and I helped cover it up. My name was Sophia and I was 25 years old, working as a mine safety inspector for the state of Virginia when I discovered evidence that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had taken the job with the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy straight out of college, believing I could make a difference in protecting the lives of coal miners who risked everything to extract the black gold that powered America. Buchanan County was one of the most dangerous mining regions in Appalachia, with a history of accidents, cave-ins, and explosions that stretched back to the early 1900s. The Blackwater Mine, owned by Consolidated Mining Corporation, had been operating since 1952 and employed nearly 200 men from the surrounding mountain communities. The explosion occurred on a Tuesday morning in November, deep in shaft number 7, where a crew of 12 miners had been working the overnight shift. According to the initial reports, a methane gas leak had ignited, causing a massive explosion that collapsed several hundred feet of tunnel and trapped the workers with no possibility of rescue. The official investigation concluded that faulty ventilation equipment had allowed dangerous gas levels to accumulate, and that the explosion was a tragic but predictable industrial accident. But 3 days after the explosion, while conducting my routine inspection of the mine's safety records, I discovered evidence that suggested a far more sinister explanation for what had happened in shaft number 7. Hidden among routine maintenance reports, I found documentation showing that the 12 dead miners had been planning to meet with federal investigators from the Environmental Protection Agency about illegal dumping of toxic waste in the groundwater that supplied drinking water to several mountain communities. The miners had discovered that Consolidated Mining Corporation had been secretly disposing of chemical byproducts from their coal processing operations by pumping them into abandoned mine shafts that connected to underground aquifers. The contamination was already causing health problems in families who lived near the disposal sites, including an unusual cluster of cancer cases among children and elderly residents. The 12 men who died in the explosion had been collecting water samples and documenting the company's illegal activities for nearly 6 months. When I examined the mine's safety equipment more closely, I found clear evidence that the ventilation system in shaft number 7 had been deliberately sabotaged. Someone had used cutting tools to damage the gas detection sensors that should have warned workers about dangerous methane levels. The explosion had not been caused by equipment failure, but by someone who had intentionally created conditions that would result in the deaths of the 12 witnesses who threatened to expose the company's environmental crimes. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that presenting it to local law enforcement would be futile. Sheriff Raymond Couch was the brother-in-law of Consolidated Mining's regional manager, and half the county commissioners had financial interests in the company's operations. The mayor of the county seat had been elected with campaign contributions from mining industry donors, and the local newspaper depended on advertising revenue from companies that did business with Consolidated Mining. Instead, I decided to contact federal authorities directly, believing that the Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI would have the independence and resources necessary to investigate both the murders and the environmental crimes that had motivated them. But before I could make any official reports, I was approached by Margaret Hendricks, the Vice President of Safety Operations for Consolidated Mining Corporation. Margaret was a well-dressed woman in her 50s who had built her career in the mining industry by maintaining friendly relationships with government regulators and ensuring that potentially damaging investigations never gained momentum. She invited me to lunch at the fanciest restaurant in the county seat, where she made an offer that would change the course of my life in ways I could never have anticipated. She knew about my discovery of the sabotaged safety equipment, she explained, because the company had been monitoring all communications related to the explosion investigation. She also knew about my mother's recent cancer diagnosis and the mounting medical bills that were threatening to bankrupt our family despite our health insurance coverage. Margaret offered me $50,000 in cash to modify my inspection report, ruling the explosion an accidental result of equipment failure rather than deliberate sabotage. The money would be more than enough to pay for my mother's experimental cancer treatments that were not covered by insurance. Treatments that might save her life but would otherwise be financially impossible for our family to afford. All I had to do was submit a falsified report stating that the ventilation system had failed due to normal wear and tear, and that the explosion was a tragic but unavoidable industrial accident. I told Margaret I needed time to consider her offer, but we both knew that my decision was already made. My mother was dying, and I had the power to save her life by sacrificing the truth about 12 men who were already dead. It was a choice between the living and the dead, between family loyalty and professional ethics, and I chose my mother's life over justice for the murdered miners. The process of falsifying my inspection report was surprisingly simple. I replaced the damaged ventilation equipment with identical components that showed normal wear patterns, and I altered the gas sensor readings to indicate levels that were dangerous but not immediately fatal. I submitted documentation that supported the official narrative of an accidental explosion caused by routine equipment failure and inadequate safety protocols. The $50,000 appeared in my bank account within a week, deposited in small increments that would not attract attention from federal banking regulators. My mother began her experimental cancer treatments immediately, and for several months it appeared that both she and I would benefit from my decision to participate in the cover-up of the Blackwater mine murders. But the psychological cost of my actions began to manifest almost immediately. I could not sleep without experiencing nightmares about the 12 dead miners, dreams in which they appeared to me covered in coal dust and asking why I had chosen to hide the truth about their murders. During the day, I found it increasingly difficult to focus on my work, knowing that every safety inspection I conducted was tainted by my willingness to falsify official reports when offered sufficient financial incentive. More disturbing was my growing awareness of the environmental consequences of the toxic waste disposal that had motivated the murders. Over the following months, I began documenting health problems in the communities affected by groundwater contamination, problems that were far more extensive than I had initially realized. Children were developing leukemia at rates that were statistically impossible for a rural population. Adults were suffering from liver and kidney diseases that had no apparent cause other than long-term exposure to industrial chemicals. The contamination was not limited to drinking water supplies. The toxic chemicals that Consolidated Mining had been dumping in abandoned mine shafts were seeping into soil and air, creating an environmental disaster that would affect generations of mountain families. And because of my falsified report, there was no official investigation into the company's illegal disposal practices, no cleanup efforts, and no medical assistance for the victims of chemical poisoning. My mother's cancer treatments were initially successful, and for nearly a year it appeared that the experimental therapy might save her life. But the reprieve was temporary. The cancer returned more aggressively than before, and despite the expensive treatments that my cover-up money had made possible, my mother died 18 months after my meeting with Margaret Hendricks. Her death left me with the terrible realization that I had betrayed 12 murdered men and their families for nothing. The money that had seemed so important when my mother's life was at stake now felt like payment for my participation in a conspiracy that had cost dozens of lives and would continue to kill innocent people for decades to come. I had traded my integrity for a few extra months with my mother. Months that ended in her death anyway. The guilt became unbearable when I began attending funerals for children who had died from cancers caused by the contaminated water that I could have helped expose. Families that had trusted government safety inspectors like me to protect them from corporate negligence were burying their sons and daughters because I had chosen financial gain over professional responsibility. Each death was a direct consequence of my decision to hide the truth about the Blackwater mine murders and the environmental crimes that had motivated them. 3 years after the explosion, I attempted to correct my mistake by contacting federal investigators with the real evidence about the sabotaged safety equipment and the illegal waste disposal operations. But by then, too much time had passed and too many people had died for my testimony to have any meaningful impact. The original evidence had been destroyed or disappeared, and the witnesses who might have supported my account had either moved away or were too frightened to speak publicly about what they had known. Margaret Hendricks had retired from Consolidated Mining and moved to Florida, taking with her the institutional knowledge of how the cover-up had been orchestrated and maintained. The company itself had been sold to a larger corporation that claimed no responsibility for the actions of previous management, and the new owners had no interest in investigating historical environmental crimes that might result in costly cleanup efforts. The 12 miners who had died in the Blackwater explosion were officially remembered as victims of an industrial accident, their families receiving modest compensation payments that prevented them from pursuing wrongful death lawsuits against Consolidated Mining. The environmental contamination continued for years before being discovered by independent researchers. But by then, the damage was irreversible and the responsible parties were beyond the reach of legal consequences. I never worked as a safety inspector again after leaving Virginia. The psychological toll of my participation in the cover-up made it impossible for me to continue in a profession that required me to put public safety above personal interests. I moved to North Carolina and found work in a completely different field, but the weight of my actions followed me wherever I went. The money that Margaret Hendricks had paid me for my falsified report was eventually donated to cancer research organizations, but this gesture felt hollow given the number of people who had died because of the contamination I had helped conceal. No amount of charitable giving could undo the damage caused by my decision to prioritize my family's immediate needs over the long-term health and safety of an entire community. Today, more than 30 years after the Blackwater mine explosion, the groundwater in several Buchanan County communities remains contaminated with industrial chemicals that cause cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. The families affected by this contamination have no legal recourse because the statute of limitations has expired and the responsible parties are beyond prosecution. They continue to suffer and die from diseases that could have been prevented if I had chosen courage over comfort, truth over money. The lesson I learned from my experience is that some choices cannot be undone, and some consequences cannot be escaped through good intentions or charitable actions. The 12 men who died in that explosion were murdered to protect corporate profits and environmental crimes, and I became an accessory to their murders by choosing my own family's welfare over justice for their families. That choice continues to define who I am more than 3 decades later, and it will continue to define me for whatever years remain of my life. The screaming started at 2:43 a.m. on the 3rd night of our cave expedition. I was 23, leading a group of geology students through the Cumberland Cave system in southeastern Kentucky when we discovered something that shouldn't exist. My name was Tyler, and as a graduate student in speleology at Eastern Kentucky University, I had explored dozens of cave systems throughout Appalachia. But nothing had prepared me for what we encountered in the deepest passages of Cumberland Mountain. Our expedition consisted of 6 people. Myself as the lead guide, 2 other graduate students named Kevin and Madison, and 3 undergraduate geology majors who were participating in an advanced field study course. We had obtained proper permits to explore the restricted sections of Cumberland Cave, areas that required specialized equipment and experienced leadership due to the complex 3-dimensional maze of passages that extended for miles beneath the mountain. The cave system had been mapped to a depth of approximately 800 feet, but recent ground-penetrating radar surveys had detected additional chambers that might extend the known system by several miles. Our mission was to locate and document these unmapped passages, collecting geological samples and creating detailed surveys that would contribute to scientific understanding of limestone cave formation in the Appalachian region. The first 2 days of exploration proceeded normally, with our team methodically mapping known passages and identifying potential routes into the deeper sections of the cave. We established our base camp about 400 feet underground in a large chamber called Cathedral Hall, where previous expeditions had left permanent climbing anchors and established reliable communication with the surface support team. On the 3rd day, we discovered the entrance to what appeared to be a previously unknown passage system that descended at a steep angle toward the deepest parts of the mountain. The passage was narrow but navigable, requiring us to crawl through sections that were barely wider than our bodies while carrying all our equipment and scientific instruments. The airflow through the passage indicated that it connected to significant open spaces deeper in the mountain, spaces that might represent major discoveries in cave exploration. As we descended through this new passage system, we began encountering evidence of human presence that predated any known exploration of the cave. The walls were covered with paintings created using some kind of mineral pigment that had been applied thousands of years ago based on the style and weathering patterns we observed. The paintings depicted human figures engaged in what appeared to be religious ceremonies centered around a massive creature that dominated the underground chambers. The creature shown in the cave paintings was unlike any known animal, combining characteristics of various species in ways that suggested either artistic imagination or depiction of something that existed only in the deepest parts of the cave system. It had multiple eyes arranged in rows along what might have been its head, and numerous appendages that could have been arms, legs, or tentacles depending on how the ancient artists had intended them to be interpreted. More disturbing than the paintings themselves was the discovery of actual human remains in some of the deeper chambers we explored. These were not ancient burials or the remains of prehistoric cave dwellers, but the skeletons of people who had been wearing modern clothing and carrying equipment that indicated they had been cave explorers from various time periods over the past century. Some of the remains were so recent that fabric and leather were still intact, suggesting that people had been dying in these deep chambers on a regular basis for decades. As we continued our exploration, we began encountering a strange bioluminescent fungus that covered the walls and ceiling of the deepest passages. The fungus emitted a pale blue-green light that was beautiful but also unsettling, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made it difficult to judge distances and navigate safely through the complex cave system. More concerning was the discovery that extended exposure to this fungus produced hallucinogenic effects that began to affect our team's judgment and perception. Kevin was the first to report experiencing vivid hallucinations after several hours in the fungus-covered passages. He described seeing movement in his peripheral vision and hearing voices calling his name from unexplored side passages. Madison began complaining of headaches and nausea that intensified the deeper we went into the cave system. The 3 undergraduate students became increasingly anxious and disoriented, with one of them insisting that something was following our group through the darkness. By the end of the 3rd day, all of us were experiencing symptoms that suggested toxic exposure to whatever compounds the bioluminescent fungus was releasing into the cave atmosphere. But we were also making remarkable discoveries that seemed to justify the risks we were taking. The cave system was far more extensive than anyone had realized, with chambers large enough to hold entire buildings and passages that seemed to extend for miles beneath the Cumberland mountain range. That night, while we were sleeping in our underground camp in one of the larger chambers, the screaming began. It was not the sound of any animal I could identify, but something that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave itself. The sound was so loud and so alien that it woke all 6 members of our expedition simultaneously, and we immediately began checking our equipment to determine if some kind of geological event was occurring. The screaming continued intermittently for several hours, always seeming to come from deeper in the cave system, from passages we had not yet explored. Between the screams, we could hear what sounded like massive objects moving through the cave, scraping against stone walls and causing vibrations that we could feel through the cave floor. Whatever was making these sounds was enormous and powerful, capable of moving through spaces that would be impassable for any known cave-dwelling animal. When morning came, Kevin was missing from our camp. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal equipment was still in place, and there were no signs that he had left voluntarily. We conducted an immediate search of all the passages near our camp, but found no trace of him except for a trail of disturbed fungus on the cave walls that seemed to lead deeper into the unexplored sections of the cave system. As we followed this trail searching for Kevin, we began to understand that the cave system was not simply a natural geological formation, but had been modified by some intelligence that lived in its deepest recesses. Passages had been widened in some areas and deliberately blocked in others, creating a maze-like structure that seemed designed to funnel intruders towards specific locations. The bioluminescent fungus had been cultivated and arranged in patterns that served as a kind of lighting system for whatever used these passages regularly. The trail led us to a chamber that was unlike anything we had seen in our previous cave explorations. The space was enormous, easily large enough to hold a football stadium, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond the range of our lights. The walls were covered with the bioluminescent fungus arranged in complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, creating an effect that was both beautiful and terrifying. In the center of this chamber, we discovered Kevin. He was alive but unconscious, lying on a raised platform that appeared to have been carved from the natural stone floor of the cave. Around him were arranged the remains of other explorers, some recent and some that appeared to have been there for decades. All of the bodies showed signs of having been drained of their bodily fluids, leaving behind mummified remains that looked like they had been preserved through some unknown process. As we approached Kevin to attempt a rescue, the creature that inhabited this chamber finally revealed itself. It emerged from passages in the chamber walls that were too small to have accommodated something of its size, suggesting that it possessed to alter its physical form in ways that defied biological understanding. The creature was massive, easily 15 feet tall when it extended itself to its full height, with a body structure that seemed to shift and change as we watched. The most terrifying aspect of the creature was its obvious intelligence. This was not a mindless predator acting on instinct, but a thinking entity that had been using the cave system as a trap to capture and feed on human explorers for decades or possibly centuries. It had cultivated the hallucinogenic fungus to disorient its prey, modified the cave passages to create an inescapable maze, and used the ancient cave paintings to lure curious researchers into its domain. When the creature spoke, its voice was not heard but felt, resonating through the stone walls of the chamber and vibrating through our bones. It communicated not in any human language, but through direct transmission of concepts and emotions that our minds interpreted as words. The creature explained that it had been feeding on the life force of humans for thousands of years, using the cave system as both its home and its hunting ground. Kevin was not dead, but he was being slowly drained of whatever energy the creature required for its survival. The process was gradual, designed to keep victims alive for extended periods while their life force was extracted. The other remains we had observed were the desiccated husks of previous victims who had been completely consumed over periods that might have lasted weeks or months. The creature offered us a choice. We could leave the cave immediately, abandoning Kevin and promising never to return or reveal the location of its feeding chamber. In exchange, it would allow the rest of us to survive and would relocate to a different cave system where it would no longer threaten explorers in the Cumberland Mountain area. The alternative was that we would all become its prisoners, providing the sustained feeding it required to maintain its existence in this deep underground domain. I chose to save my team. We left Kevin behind and retreated through the cave system as quickly as our equipment and physical condition would allow. The journey back to the surface took 18 hours of continuous climbing and crawling, during which we were constantly aware that the creature could have prevented our escape at any time if it had chosen to break its agreement with us. When we reached the surface, we immediately contacted park authorities and cave rescue specialists, but the story we told them was necessarily incomplete. We reported that Kevin had become lost in an unmapped section of the cave during a rockfall that had blocked the passage where we last saw him. The search and rescue operation that followed lasted for 5 days, but recovered no trace of Kevin or the deep chambers where we had encountered the creature. The fungal exposure had lasting effects on all of us. Madison developed chronic respiratory problems that eventually forced her to abandon her geology career. The 3 undergraduate students all changed their academic majors after completing the semester, none of them willing to continue studying subjects that might require them to work in underground environments. I completed my graduate degree but have never returned to cave exploration, and I strongly advise others to avoid the deepest sections of any Appalachian cave systems. The official report of our expedition made no mention of the creature or the chamber where Kevin was taken. The Cumberland Cave system was subsequently classified as too dangerous for civilian exploration, and access to the deeper passages has been permanently restricted by federal authorities who cited unstable geological conditions and toxic air quality as the reasons for closure. But I know that Kevin is still down there, along with the remains of dozens of other explorers who made the mistake of venturing too deep into places where ancient predators still hunt in the darkness beneath the mountains.